The world was made of jolting wood and the ceaseless groan of leather. For 3 days. That was all Clara Whitmore had known. The stagecoach, a cramped and musty box on wheels, pitched and shuddered over a road that was more a suggestion than a reality, carved into the flesh of the Montana Territory. Outside the grimy window, a landscape of brutal beauty scrolled past, endless forests of pine and fir, their dark green ranks marching up the sides of mountains that tore at the sky. The wind, a wild and lonely thing, howled through the canyons, its voice a constant lament that seeped through the cracks in the coach and settled deep in her bones. She was 19 years old, and she had never felt a cold so complete. It was more than the sharp bite of the autumn air. It was a chill that had taken root in her soul the day her stepfather, Franklin, had sat her down at the kitchen table back in Ohio, his face a mask of false regret. His eyes, usually shifty and slick with greed, had for once held a flicker of something she might have mistaken for shame, had she not known him better. He spoke of unfortunate turns of luck, of debts that had to be honored. He called it an arrangement, a fine opportunity. He did not use the words old, but Clara had heard it all the same, in the space between his carefully chosen phrases. He had shown her a letter, penned in a surprisingly neat hand on rough paper, from a man named Elias Boone, a man who sought a wife, a companion to share his life in the mountains. He had enclosed a bank draft for $500. It was enough to cover Franklin's losses at the poker table and then some. Clara had stared at the sum, the price of her life, and felt a strange sort of numbness. It was the final, inevitable betrayal in a life that had been slowly stripped of warmth and safety since her mother had passed 4 years prior. Franklin had painted a picture of a respectable homesteader, a man of property and standing. He had conveniently omitted the whispers he must have heard, the truths that lay buried in the terse lines of the letter. He had packed her bags himself, pressing a ticket into her hand and steering her toward the train station before she had a chance to fully comprehend the finality of it all. He had not said goodbye. Now, bumping along in the belly of this wooden beast, Clara felt the last vestiges of her old life falling away with every mile. She was a ghost, haunting the space between a past that no longer existed and a future she could not bear to imagine. Her hands, pale and slender, were accustomed to embroidery needles and the cool ivory of piano keys, not the grit and hardship this land promised. Her dresses, made of fine wool and lawn, felt foolishly out of place, a sad reminder of a gentility that had no currency here. Everything about her, from her soft, carefully modulated voice to the delicate slope of her shoulders, screamed of the East, of a world that was tamed and ordered. This place was neither. Her fingers, stiff with cold, closed around the one comfort she had left. It was a small, silver locket, worn smooth with time, that hung from a chain around her neck. Inside was a miniature portrait of her mother, her smile serene and loving. Clara would press the cool metal to her cheek, closing her eyes and trying to summon the memory of her mother's scent, of vanilla and rosewater, a fragrance lost to the prevailing odors of pine, damp earth, and horse. The locket was a fragile shield against the vast, terrifying emptiness of both the landscape and her future. The stagecoach finally lurched to a halt in a spray of mud and gravel. The driver, a grizzled man named Silas, who had spoken no more than 20 words to her the entire journey, grunted from his perch. "This is it, Big Elk." Clara peered out. The town was little more than a single, wide street carved from a muddy clearing, flanked by a dozen or so buildings of raw, unpainted timber, a general store, a saloon with swinging doors, a blacksmith's forge sending plumes of dark smoke into the gray sky, and a small, white church with a crooked steeple. It was a place that seemed to be clinging to the edge of the wilderness by its fingernails. As Silas helped her down, her worn leather boots sinking into the thick mud, a silence fell over the street. It was a heavy, watchful quiet, A woman shaking a rug on the porch of the general store froze, her hands still. Two men leaning against a hitching post straightened up, their conversation dying on their lips. Faces appeared in windows, eyes following her every move. Clara felt a blush of heat creep up her neck. She was an oddity, a spectacle, a fragile bird blown far from its familiar cage. Silas unloaded her single trunk, dropping it onto the boardwalk with a thud. He pointed a thick finger toward a man standing near the store, a portly fellow with a nervous twitch in his eye. "That's Mr. Abernathy. He'll see you the rest of the way." Having fulfilled his duty, Silas climbed back onto his seat without another word, cracked his whip, and the stagecoach rumbled away, leaving Clara alone in the oppressive silence. Mr. Abernathy approached, wringing his hands. He was the town's postmaster and, apparently, the one who had facilitated her arrangement. He offered a weak, watery smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice hushed, as if they were in a library. "Welcome to Big Elk. I trust your journey was tolerable." "It was long," Clara answered, her own voice barely a whisper. The staring continued. She could feel the weight of their gazes, a mixture of pity and a strange, fearful respect. She heard a word whispered from the shadows of the saloon porch, a name that seemed to hang in the air like frost. Boone. Mr. Abernathy's smile faltered. "Yes, well, it's a fair way up to his place. Best we get started before the weather turns." He gestured to a sturdy-looking mule tied to a post. "I'll get your trunk secured." No one offered to help. They just watched as Mr. Abernathy struggled with the heavy trunk, his face glistening with sweat despite the cold. They watched as Clara, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, stood small and alone. They knew where she was going. They knew who she was for, and in their eyes, she was already lost. The trail leading away from Big Elk was not a road. It was a treacherous ribbon of earth and rock that clung to the side of the mountain, winding ever upward into the clouds. The air grew thinner, colder. The path was steep and mister. Abernathy led the mule while Clara walked behind, her breath coming in ragged puffs, her legs aching with the effort. The sounds of the town faded away, replaced by the rush of a distant waterfall and the sighing of the wind in the colossal pines. This was a different kind of silence than the one in the town. This was the profound, ancient silence of a world that was utterly indifferent to human existence. It was a loneliness so vast it felt like a physical presence walking beside her. After what felt like an eternity of climbing, the trail leveled out into a small, high meadow, and there, nestled against a sheer wall of granite, was a cabin. It was not a home. It was a fortress, built of massive, interlocking logs, chinked with mud and moss. It seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. A curl of gray smoke rose from a stone chimney, a lonely signal of life in the immense wilderness. Animal pelts, wolf, deer, beaver, were stretched and tacked to the outer walls to dry. An axe was buried in a large chopping block near the door, its blade gleaming. Mr. Abernathy stopped, keeping a respectful distance from the cabin. He would go no further. "This is it, miss," he said, his relief palpable. He quickly untied her trunk and set it on the ground, eager to be gone. "He's expecting you." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. She looked from the postmaster's retreating back to the silent, imposing cabin. There was nowhere left to run. Taking a breath that felt thin and useless, she walked forward, her boots making soft sounds on the packed earth. The door opened before she reached it. The man who filled the doorway was bigger than any man she had ever seen. He was a creature of the mountain, built of the same stone and timber as his home. Broad shoulders strained the fabric of his homespun shirt, and his hands, which hung loose at his sides, were large and calloused. His hair was the color of dark earth, long and untamed, and his beard was thick, hiding the line of his jaw. He was silent, watching her approach with eyes the color of a stormy sky. But it was his face that held her captive. A latticework of old scars marred the left side. From his temple down to his chin, the marks were pale against his weathered skin, relics of a violent encounter. One scar tugged at the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent expression that was somewhere between a grimace and a snarl. He was terrifying, and yet there was a stillness about him, a deep, rooted calm that was at odds with his savage appearance. He stood his ground, unmoving, as solid and unreadable as the mountain behind him. Clara stopped a few feet away, her throat too tight to speak. His voice, when it finally came, was nothing like she expected. It was not a growl or a bellow. It was a low, careful rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. "You're the woman." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. She could only nod, her gaze fixed on the scarred landscape of his face. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. "The preacher is on his way. He'll be here before the snow." He stepped back from the doorway, a silent invitation for her to enter the life that was now hers. The marriage ceremony was as bleak and cold as the air that carried the preacher's words. Reverend Michael, a thin, anxious man from Big Elk, had arrived on a tired-looking horse, his face pinched with worry. He rushed through the vows, his Bible trembling in his hands, his eyes darting from Elias's impassive face to the darkening clouds that were gathering over the peaks. The wind had picked up, whipping Clara's hair across her face and stealing the words from the preacher's mouth. Clara stood beside Elias, a stranger whose name she had only just learned for certain. She felt his presence beside her, a wall of heat and silence. She did not look at him. She stared at a distant pine tree, its branches thrashing in the wind, and whispered the required responses. "I do." The words felt like ash in her mouth. She was not Clara Whitmore anymore. She was Mrs. Boone. As soon as the final, joyless pronouncement was made, Reverend Michael all but ran for his horse, muttering about the coming storm. He did not stay for a celebratory meal, for there was none offered. He did not offer a blessing for their home. He simply fled, leaving the two of them alone on the precipice of their new life as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the leaden sky. Elias said nothing. He turned and carried her trunk inside the cabin, setting it down by the stone hearth. The interior was Spartan and impeccably clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room. A bed, built into the far wall, was covered with a thick bear skin. Shelves held a few pewter dishes, sacks of flour and beans, and a small collection of books. His rifle, a long and deadly-looking piece of machinery, rested on pegs above the mantelpiece. The only smells were of wood smoke, pine, and something clean and wild, like cold river water. Without a word, he stoked the fire, adding logs until it blazed brightly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted motions. He was a man accustomed to solitude, a man whose life was a series of simple, necessary tasks. He prepared a meal of stew from a pot that had been simmering over the fire, its savory aroma filling the small space. He ladled it into 2 bowls, placing one on the table for her and taking his own to sit on the floor by the hearth, his back to her. They ate in silence. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howl of the rising storm outside. Clara could not eat. The stew tasted of fear. Every muscle in her body was tense, waiting for the night, waiting for him. He was her husband. He had paid for her. He had rights. Her mind recoiled from the thought. A panicked animal in a cage. When he was finished, he took her untouched bowl, scraped its contents back into the pot, and washed both bowls in a bucket of water. The domesticity of the act was jarring, surreal. He did not look at her, did not speak to her. He was a phantom of a husband, a silent partner in a transaction she had not agreed to. Finally, he banked the fire for the night, leaving the cabin in a dim, flickering gloom. Clara's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it, the moment she had been dreading for weeks. She sat frozen on the chair, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Elias turned from the fire. He walked to the mantelpiece and took down his rifle. He checked its mechanism with an expert's familiarity. Then he moved toward the bed. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer dying on her lips. But he walked past the bed. He went to the door, setting the rifle down beside it. He pulled on a heavy coat made of wolf pelts and picked up a thick woolen blanket from a chest. He looked at her then, his gaze unreadable in the firelight. For a moment, she thought he might speak, but he only gave that same small, almost imperceptible nod. And then he opened the door and walked out into the swirling snow of the blizzard, closing it softly behind him. Clara sat in stunned silence, listening to the storm rage outside. He had left. He was sleeping outside, in the heart of a blizzard, by whatever fire he could manage to build on the covered porch. She was alone in the warm cabin, in the bed that was meant to be theirs. She crept to the small window, her body trembling, and wiped away the condensation. In the faint glow from the cabin, she could just make out his massive shape, wrapped in the blanket, sitting on a stool near the wall. Sheltered from the worst of the wind, he was a statue, a guardian at the gate of her prison. Confusion warred with a profound, shuddering relief. It was so complete it left her weak. He had not touched her. He had not demanded what was his by law and custom. Was this some form of punishment? Was she so unappealing to him, so disappointing, that he would rather face a blizzard than share a bed with her? Was it rejection? Or was it mercy? The thought was so startling, so at odds with the terrifying image of the scarred mountain man, that she could barely hold on to it. She stumbled to the bed he had given her entirely, and crawled under the heavy bearskin. It smelled of him, of pine and cold air, and something wild. She lay there, shaking, listening to the wind and the silence, her mind a maelstrom of fear and a fragile, burgeoning sliver of wonder. She woke to a world of white silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick blanket of pristine snow that muffled all sound. Sunlight, brilliant and cold, streamed through the window. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The comfort of the warm bed a deceptive cocoon. Then the memory of the night before crashed down on her, and she sat up, her heart pounding. The cabin was empty. The fire in the hearth had been built up, a cheerful blaze that pushed back the morning chill. A pot of coffee was warming beside it, its aroma rich and inviting. Clara slid from the bed, her bare feet cold on the wooden floorboards. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her dress. She crept to the door and pulled it open a crack, peering outside. The sound reached her first, a steady, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack. Elias was in the clearing, his back to her. He had shed his heavy coat, and the muscles in his broad back and shoulders bunched and released as he swung a heavy axe, splitting logs with clean, powerful strokes. The crisp morning air misted with each of his breaths. He moved with a relentless, untiring grace, a force of nature as much as the mountain he inhabited. He must have sensed her watching him, because he stopped, his axe buried in a log. He stood for a moment, motionless, before slowly turning to face her. The morning sun lit the scarred side of his face, making the pale lines stand out in stark relief. His expression was as unreadable as ever. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She expected anger, or impatience, or at the very least, a cold command. He simply looked at her, standing small and fragile in the doorway of his home. He pulled the axe free, leaned it against the chopping block, and wiped his hands on his trousers. He took a step toward her, and she flinched. An involuntary retreat. He stopped. His deep voice cut through the clean, cold air. It was quiet, but it carried, each word deliberate and clear. You don't owe me anything." He held her gaze for a second longer, then turned back to his work, picking up the axe as if the conversation, the only real conversation they had ever had, was over. The steady chopping began again, a heartbeat in the silent, snow-covered world. Clara stood in the doorway, the cold air on her face, the warmth of the fire at her back. He had not rejected her. He had freed her. She had been sold and delivered like a piece of cargo, but the man who had received her refused to claim his property. Her confusion was a vast, uncharted territory. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but now it was joined by something else, something sharp and insistent and utterly new. Curiosity. Who was this man? Elias Boone? This scarred, silent giant who would face a blizzard alone rather than frighten a girl he did not know, and who, in the bright light of morning, asked for nothing in return. She watched him work, a man of profound and unsettling contradictions, and knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that her journey had only just begun. The days that followed fell into a pattern of silence, a rhythm of unspoken rules and vast, empty spaces. Clara learned the shape of her new life not through words, but through the ache in her muscles and the chill that never quite left her fingers. Life in the high mountains was a constant, grueling labor. The simple act of fetching water required her to haul 2 heavy wooden buckets from a creek that ran icy and fast 100 yards from the cabin, her shoulders straining and the wire handles biting into her palms. She learned to mend Elias's coarse woolen shirts, her delicate stitches looking out of place against the rough fabric. Cooking was a daily exercise in frustration. Back in Ohio, she had a pantry stocked with a dozen kinds of spice, with white flour and soft sugar. Here, she had sacks of beans, cornmeal, potatoes, and salted pork. Elias would return from his hunting trips, silent as a shadow, and leave a brace of rabbits or a haunch of venison on the table without a word. It was a bounty that she, with her limited knowledge, struggled to transform into anything palatable. More than once, she burned the cornbread or made a stew so thin and tasteless she could barely swallow it herself. Elias ate whatever she put before him, his expression unchanging, never offering a word of complaint or praise. His silence was a wall she could not seem to breach. He avoided her eyes. It was a deliberate, consistent act. If she was by the hearth, he would be at the table. If she was mending by the window, he would be outside, his back to the cabin, oiling a trap or sharpening his knife. He spent his days away, disappearing into the forest at dawn with his rifle over his shoulder. He was checking his trap lines. He was hunting. He was repairing fences along the edge of the meadow where his 2 horses grazed. He would return at dusk, smelling of pine and cold air, a provider who was also a ghost in his own home. He gave her everything she needed to survive, and nothing she needed to live. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on her day and night. The silence of the cabin was a living thing, broken only by the crackle of the fire or the sigh of the wind. She missed voices. She yearned for the sound of laughter, for the meaningless chatter of women at a quilting bee, for the simple, comforting noise of other people living their lives. Safety had been an assumption in her old world. Here, its absence was a constant, low-grade fear. Every snap of a twig outside, every shadow that moved at the edge of the woods, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She was a prisoner in a cage without bars, stranded on an island in a sea of mountains. Her hands grew rough, the skin chapped and red. A fine dress she had insisted on packing was snagged on a nail and torn, and she had wept with a grief that felt far too large for a simple piece of cloth. She was changing, being weathered and worn down by this place, just like the gray, ancient rocks that dotted the landscape. One evening, the wind began to howl with a new and terrifying ferocity. It was the sound of a predator, a monster clawing at the walls of the cabin. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain that erased the world. Elias, who had been outside securing the horses in their lean-to, came in and barred the door, a fine dusting of white on his shoulders. He said nothing, but the set of his jaw was grim. The blizzard had arrived. For 2 days, they were trapped. The wind shrieked and moaned, a ceaseless, maddening chorus. The cabin, which had felt like a prison before, now felt like a tomb. Snow piled up against the small windows, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight, lit only by the frantic, dancing flames in the hearth. The sheer, unrelenting noise of the storm was terrifying, but it was the silence inside the cabin that truly frayed Clara's nerves. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with everything that went unsaid between them. On the second night, the storm reached its peak. The log walls of the cabin groaned under the assault of the wind, and a sound like a great beast roaring echoed down from the peaks. Clara could bear it no longer. A strangled cry escaped her lips, and she pressed her hands over her ears, her body trembling uncontrollably. The world felt as if it were being torn apart, and she was at its very center. The darkness, the noise, the crushing weight of her fear. It was too much. The edges of her vision began to blur, the firelight swimming before her eyes. She felt herself swaying, about to faint. Suddenly, a warmth settled over her shoulders. Elias was there, standing behind her chair. He had taken a heavy wool blanket from his chest and gently draped it around her. He did not touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a solid, calming presence in the chaos. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. In the flickering firelight, the scars on his face seemed deeper, darker, but his eyes held no menace. They were just watching her. His deep voice was a low rumble beneath the scream of the wind. "You'll live through worse than this," he said, his gaze steady. "If you stay." The words hung in the air between them. It was not a threat, nor was it a simple reassurance. It was a statement of fact, a piece of hard-won knowledge from a man who knew what it was to endure. In that moment, Clara sensed something she had not allowed herself to believe existed, a deep, quiet kindness buried beneath the layers of his roughness. The fear did not vanish, but its sharpest edges began to soften. She pulled the blanket tighter, the scent of wood smoke and him filling her senses, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than terror in his presence. Weeks later, long after the great blizzard had passed and a fragile winter sun had returned to the sky, a rider appeared on the trail. It was a rare event, an intrusion from the world below. The man was a trapper named Jebediah, his face hidden by a thick, frosted beard. He carried a small sack of mail for the scattered homesteads in the mountains. He had one letter for the Boone cabin. For her. Her heart leaped. The envelope was addressed in her stepfather's familiar, looping script. For a wild, foolish moment, she felt a surge of hope. Perhaps he was writing to tell her it was all a mistake. Perhaps he had come into money and was sending for her to come home. Elias took the letter from the rider, their exchange brief and businesslike, and handed it to her. He watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before turning and walking away toward the lean-to, giving her privacy. Clara's fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The letter was short, the words hastily scrawled. It was not a summons home. It was a confession and a farewell. Franklin wrote that the money Elias had sent was gone, along with other funds he had borrowed. His creditors were closing in. He was heading west, to California, or perhaps further. Somewhere no one knew his name. He wished her well. He told her not to try and find him. He signed it simply, F. The paper fell from her hands. The hope that had flared within her moments before was extinguished, leaving behind a cold, black ash. He had taken the money and fled. He had not just sold her. He had abandoned her completely, severing the last frayed thread that connected her to her old life. She could never go back. There was nothing to go back to. She was stranded, marooned. left to whatever fate awaited her in this wild, unforgiving place with a man who did not want her. A sound, a ragged gasp of pure despair, tore itself from her throat. She could not breathe. The cabin walls were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. She had to get out. Without thinking, she turned and ran. She burst out of the cabin door and into the blinding white of the snow-covered meadow. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to escape the crushing weight of her new reality. The cold air burned her lungs, and the deep snow grabbed at her skirts, trying to pull her down. She ran, stumbling and falling, fueled by a grief so profound it felt like madness. The world was a blur of white snow and black despair. Finally, her strength gave out. Her legs tangled beneath her, and she fell, her face pressing into the cold, soft powder. And then there was only darkness. She surfaced slowly, as if from a great depth. The first thing she felt was warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be seeping into her very bones. The second thing she heard was a heartbeat, slow and strong, beating close to her ear. She was moving. Her eyes fluttered open. She was in Elias's arms. He was carrying her back to the cabin, his long, powerful strides eating up the distance. Her head was pillowed against the solid wall of his chest, and his arms were wrapped securely around her, holding her as if she were a child. She could feel the tension in his body, a fine, coiled trembling that ran through his powerful frame. It was not from the cold, or from her slight weight. It was something else. Emotion, raw and powerful. He carried her inside and laid her gently on the bed, pulling the bearskin up to her chin. His face, when she looked up at him, was a mask of fierce, terrible anger. "Foolish girl," he rasped, his voice harsh, cracking with a strange intensity. "What were you trying to do? Die out there? Is your life so worthless you'd throw it away in the snow?" The words were like stones, sharp and cruel. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, hot against her cold skin. He saw them, and the anger in his face crumbled, replaced by a look of profound, aching regret. He took a half-step back, running a hand over his face, over the scars that seemed to define him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And for the first time since she had met him, his voice broke. It was a sound of such raw, unguarded pain that it stunned her into silence. "I did not mean, I was afraid." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and she saw past the scars and the silence. She saw the loneliness that lived in his eyes, a desolation that matched the vast, empty wilderness outside. It was a loneliness she was beginning to understand. He did not speak again for the rest of the day. He busied himself with chores, his movements quiet and subdued. But something had shifted between them. The wall of his silence was still there, but a crack had appeared, a small fissure through which she had glimpsed the man hiding behind it. That night, as the fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room, he finally spoke. He sat on the floor by the hearth, staring into the flames, his back to her as she lay in the bed, watching him. "I lost them," he said, his voice low and heavy, as if he were pulling the words up from a deep, dark well. "My wife, Sarah, and my boy, Daniel, he was 4. Clara held her breath, not daring to move. It was the spring thaw, 5 years ago. We had a different cabin then, further down the mountain, closer to the creek. The rains were heavy that year. The whole mountainside was soaked through. One night, it just let go. A landslide, mud, rock, trees. It took everything. The cabin, my family. I was out, checking on a newborn calf. I heard the noise. By the time I got back, there was nothing left, just a scar on the mountain." He fell silent for a long time, the only sound the soft hiss and crackle of the embers. Clara felt a sorrow so profound it was a physical ache in her chest. She pictured him, this massive, powerful man, standing alone before a wall of mud and ruin, having lost everything he had ever loved. "I built this place myself," he continued, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Up here, on solid rock, where nothing could move it." He paused again. "I never wanted another wife. I never wanted another family to lose. But the folks in town, the preacher, they said a man shouldn't be alone. They said it wasn't right. They pressured me, said I was becoming too wild. So I wrote the letter. It was easier than arguing." He finally turned his head, his gaze finding hers in the dim light. The pain in his eyes was a raw, open wound. "I only agreed because I thought it would make them leave me be. I never meant for you to be trapped here. I never meant for any of this." His confession settled over the quiet room, explaining everything. His silence, his distance, his sleeping outside on their wedding night. It was not a rejection of her, but a rejection of the role he had been forced to play. He was a man steeped in a grief so deep he was afraid to let anyone else in, for fear the mountain or the world would take them, too. Clara looked at the man by the fire, no longer a terrifying brute or a silent stranger, but a soul as broken and lost as her own. And in her chest, where despair had hollowed out a great, empty space, something new and fragile began to grow. It was a feeling woven from two strange threads, a deep, aching sorrow for his loss, and a tender, burgeoning warmth for the man who had suffered it. Spring did not arrive on the mountain. It waged a war. It came first as a subtle softening in the air, a change in the quality of the light. Then, the great melting began. The deep blanket of snow that had suffocated the world for months began to recede, weeping into 1,000 tiny rivulets that trickled and then rushed down the mountainside. The creek swelled into a roaring, muddy torrent, its voice a constant, powerful hum. The world, once a study in black and white, exploded into color. Patches of vibrant green grass appeared on the meadow, and soon the hillsides were dotted with the determined faces of wildflowers, purple lupine, yellow balsam root, and delicate white avalanche lilies. The air, once sharp and sterile, became thick with the scent of damp earth, pine resin, and new life. The change in the world outside mirrored a quiet, hesitant thaw within the cabin. The confession Elias had shared on that cold night had altered the very air between them. The silence was no longer a wall of awkwardness and fear, but a shared space of understanding, filled with the ghosts of his past and the uncertainties of their future. He still kept his distance, and his words were few. But Clara now understood that his quiet was a landscape of grief, not a judgment of her. With the melting of the snow, a restless energy began to stir in Clara. She could not bear to be idle, to be simply a keeper of the hearth. One morning, she took a shovel and began to turn over a patch of earth near the cabin, the dark, rocky soil resisting her every effort. She was determined to have a garden, a small piece of this wilderness that she could tame and cultivate. Elias watched her from a distance for 2 days as she struggled, her back aching and her hands blistering. On the third morning, he came out of the cabin carrying his own heavy spade. He did not say a word. He simply walked to the far end of the patch she had marked out and drove the spade deep into the earth. They worked together all day, turning the soil, pulling out rocks and stubborn roots. The shared, rhythmic labor was a conversation in itself, a language of effort and cooperation that was more eloquent than any words they could have spoken. A week later, when he returned from a rare trip down to Big Elk for supplies, he had a small cloth sack for her. Inside were seeds, beans, squash, and hardy greens. Her heart swelled with a gratitude so keen it was almost painful. It was the first gift he had ever given her. Her next project was chickens. The idea of fresh eggs felt like an impossible luxury. When she mentioned it, Elias merely grunted. But the next day, he began splitting slender logs and building a small, sturdy coop against the sunny side of the cabin. She helped him, holding the logs in place while he expertly notched them, her fingers brushing against his calloused hands. They were small, accidental touches, but they sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the spring sun. The work was slow, but the structure that rose from their shared efforts felt like more than just a house for chickens. It felt like a foundation. He began to teach her the things she needed to know to survive here. He took her down to the roaring creek and showed her how to cast a line, how to find the quiet pools where the trout rested. He taught her to be patient, to read the water, and when she finally pulled a small, flashing fish from the current, her cry of triumph was met with the barest hint of a smile that touched the corner of his scarred mouth. It was a fleeting, miraculous thing, and she treasured the sight of it. The most difficult lesson was the rifle. His rifle was a part of him, an extension of his arm, and she was terrified of it. But he was insistent. "You need to know," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If I'm not here, you need to be able to protect yourself. From wolves, from men." He took her to the far end of the meadow and set up a tin can on a stump. He showed her how to hold the heavy weapon, how to brace its wooden stock against her shoulder. His body was close behind hers, his large hands guiding her smaller ones, positioning them on the cold steel and smooth wood. His breath was warm against her ear as he spoke in a low murmur, explaining how to line up the sights. "Easy now," he said, his hand covering hers on the stock. "Just a gentle squeeze." The touch was firm, instructive, and yet it sent a tremor through her entire body. A spark, sharp and unexpected, leaped between them. She was acutely aware of his nearness, of the solid strength of his chest against her back, of the scent of pine and leather that clung to him. She forgot about the rifle, about the target, about everything but the man standing behind her. Her breath hitched. He must have felt it, too. His hand tightened on hers for a barest second before he pulled away, stepping back and clearing his throat. The space between them was suddenly charged with a new, unspoken tension. The shot went wide, but a different kind of mark had been made. Their life together began to fill with small, shared moments that slowly, carefully, began to weave their separate lives into one. One evening, she left the bread in the bake oven for too long, pulling out a loaf that was blackened on the outside. She was mortified, on the verge of tears at her own foolishness. But Elias took it, broke off a piece of the burnt crust, and chewed on it thoughtfully. "A little char is good for the digestion?" he said, his face perfectly serious. A laugh bubbled up out of Clara, a genuine, unrestrained sound she had not made since she left Ohio. To her astonishment, a low chuckle rumbled in his chest in response. They ate the burnt bread together, and it was the best meal she had ever had. Another time, a late spring storm blew in with a terrifying violence. In its aftermath, while checking on the horses, they found a newborn foal, spindly and shivering, separated from its mother. The wild herd was nowhere in sight, without discussion. Elias scooped up the tiny, trembling creature and carried it into the cabin. For 2 days, they took turns feeding it warmed goat's milk from a rag, their heads bent close together in the lamplight, their hands working in tandem. The shared, gentle task filled the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. When the foal was strong enough, Elias left it in a sheltered valley where he knew the herd would find it. The quiet that descended after it was gone felt, for the first time, like a shared loss. But their fragile peace was an isolated thing, a secret kept by the mountain. Below, in Big Elk, a different story was being told, on his infrequent trips for supplies. Elias was met with sly glances and probing questions. Clara, the delicate mail-order bride, had been living on his mountain all winter, and the town's curiosity had curdled into suspicion. She was never seen. She never came to church. Whispers began to circulate in the general store and the saloon. The marriage was not real. Some said the girl was still untouched, a prisoner in the mountain man's cabin. Elias Boone was too wild, too damaged. He was not a man to be trusted with a decent woman. The gossip was a poison, seeping into the air. One afternoon, the poison found its way up the mountain. Clara was outside, tending to her small, flourishing garden, when she heard the sound of approaching horses. It was not Elias. He was checking traps on the far ridge and would not be back until dusk. 2 men rode into the clearing. She recognized them from her single, brief passage through Big Elk. They were Walt Pembroke and Brody Hetler, men with mean, narrow eyes and the kind of swagger that comes from cheap whiskey. They were both drunk. "Well now, looky here, Brody," Walt slurred, dismounting heavily. "It ain't a ghost after all. It's the little lost bird." Brody laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Prettier than they said. Wasted up here on him, ain't you, little bird?" Clara's heart froze. She stood up slowly, her hands covered in dirt, the small garden trowel clutched in her fist. "You should not be here," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This is private property." "Oh, it's private, is it?" Walt took a step closer, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her feel sick. "We just came up for a neighborly visit. See how you're getting on. Boone ain't much for company, is he? Must get lonely up here for a thing like you." He was close now, close enough for her to smell the sour stench of whiskey on his breath. Brody had moved to her other side, cutting off her path to the cabin. They were cornering her, their intentions a palpable, greasy threat in the clean mountain air. "Leave," she said, her voice a desperate whisper. "Not just yet," Brody sneered. "We just want to know if what they say is true. Is old Scarface even man enough to be your husband?" Before he could say more, a shadow fell over them. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, silent as the grave. He had come back early, moving through the forest with the quiet tread of a predator. His rifle was not in his hands. He had left it by the woodpile. He did not need it. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes colder and harder than any winter ice. The scars on his face seemed to pulsate with a terrible, contained rage. "Get away from her," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was the most dangerous sound Clara had ever heard. Walt, puffed up with drink and arrogance, turned to face him. "Now hold on, Boone. We're just talking to the little lady." "I said," Elias repeated, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "Get away from her." Walt made a fatal mistake. He laughed and reached out, his hand closing around Clara's arm. The violence was sudden and absolute. Elias moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. One moment, he was 10 feet away. The next, he was on them. He grabbed Walt's wrist, and Clara heard a sharp, sickening crack of bone. Walt screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and shock. Elias threw him backward, and he landed in a heap in the last patch of dirty, lingering snow near the edge of the woods. He did not get up. Brody, his face pale with sudden sobriety, fumbled for the pistol at his belt. He never had a chance. Elias's fist, a hammer of bone and sinew, crashed into Brody's face. The sound was a dull, wet crunch. Brody crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the dirt. It was over in seconds. The clearing was suddenly silent, save for Walt's pathetic, gasping sobs. A smear of red stained the white snow. Elias stood over the 2 men, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists. He looked from them to Clara, and the rage in his eyes was replaced by something far worse, a deep, profound guilt. He looked at his own hands as if they were alien things he did not recognize. He had proven the gossips right. He was a brute, a monster. Without another look at her, he turned and strode into the deep woods, disappearing among the trees. Clara helped the whimpering Walt onto his horse and sent him on his way, leaving Brody where he lay. He would wake eventually. Her mind was reeling, but her heart was not afraid. She went into the cabin and waited. An hour later, Elias returned. He walked to the water bucket and plunged his hands in, scrubbing at them fiercely. He would not look at her. His right hand was bleeding, the knuckles split and bruised. She came to him then, taking a clean cloth and gently taking his hand from the water. She began to carefully clean the wounds. He stood rigid, a statue of misery, refusing to meet her eyes. He expected her to recoil from him, to be horrified by the violence she had just witnessed. She finished cleaning the cuts and wrapped the cloth around his knuckles. She did not let go of his hand. She held it, her small, soft fingers wrapped around his large, damaged one. She leaned in close until her face was just inches from his. "You defended me," she whispered. He finally looked at her. He saw no fear in her eyes, no condemnation. He saw only a fierce, unwavering loyalty, a trust that he had done nothing to earn and everything. In his mind, to betray. A single hot tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the dirt on his cheek. The peace of the season was broken again, this time by the mountain itself. A sudden, unseasonably warm spell descended, and the last of the high country snow melted in a rush. The creek, already swollen, became a raging, angry river. One night, Clara was woken by a deep, groaning sound, a tremor that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Elias was already out of his blankets on the floor, his feet hitting the ground. They rushed outside into the moonlight. A section of the creek bank had given way, and the floodwater was tearing at the earth beneath the corner of the cabin, washing away the soil and exposing the foundation stones. For the next 3 days and nights, Elias worked without rest. He hauled massive rocks from the hillside, wading into the treacherous, churning water to place them, building a new, stronger wall against the flood. It was backbreaking, dangerous work. The current threatened to sweep him away with every step. Clara refused to stand by and watch. She tied a rope around her waist, securing the other end to a tree, and waded into the shallows, carrying smaller rocks, helping where she could. She brought him food and water, her own body aching with an exhaustion she had never known. The water was freezing, the rocks were heavy, and her muscles screamed in protest. But she did not stop. They were a team, bound together against the fury of the mountain. On the second day, as she handed him a piece of bread, her hands shaking with fatigue, he looked at her, his face grim with exhaustion and streaked with mud. "You should rest, Clary," he said, his voice rough. The name slipped out so naturally, a soft sound in the midst of the roaring water. Clary, not Clara, not the woman. A warmth spread through her chest, pushing back the cold and the weariness. It was a small thing, a simple shortening of her name, but it felt like a door creaking open, a sign of a deeper warmth he could no longer entirely conceal. She just shook her head and picked up another rock. They saved the cabin. When the waters finally receded, the new stone foundation stood firm, a testament to their shared will. That night, they collapsed into their separate beds, too exhausted to speak. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours before dawn, Clara woke. She did not know what had disturbed her. The cabin was silent, the fire a bed of glowing red embers. She turned her head and saw him. Elias was not in his bedroll. He was standing beside her bed, looking down at her. His face was cast in shadow, impossible to read, but there was an intensity in his posture, in the way he stood over her, that made the air feel thick. As she watched through slitted, sleepy eyes, he slowly raised his hand. He reached down, his fingers outstretched, as if to brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His hand hovered there, just an inch above her skin, trembling slightly in the dim light. She could feel the heat of it, could sense the desperate, conflicted longing in the gesture. For a long, breathless moment, he stayed like that. Then, with a quiet, shaky sigh, his hand fell back to his side. He turned and walked back to his own cold bed on the floor, leaving her in the darkness with a heart that was beating far too fast. Summer settled over the mountain like a dry, watchful hawk. The lush greens of spring faded to dusty olive and gold under the relentless sun. The days grew long and hot, filled with the buzzing of insects and the distant cry of an eagle circling in the vast, cloudless sky. Clara's garden produced a small but steady bounty of beans and squash. and the chickens provided eggs. But their stores of everything else began to dwindle. The flour sack was nearly empty. The salt was a gritty residue at the bottom of its barrel, and the coffee was gone entirely. The mountain, which had provided so much, could not provide everything. "I have to go to the trading post," Elias announced one morning, his voice flat. "We're low on necessities." Clara's heart gave a lurch. The nearest post was in a settlement called Jasper Creek, a 2-day ride through a winding, dangerous pass known to be frequented by grizzly bears. He would be gone for at least 4 days, maybe 5. The thought of being left utterly alone in the vast wilderness sent a familiar, cold tendril of fear curling in her stomach. The fragile peace she had found in their shared routines felt as if it were about to be ripped away. She watched him prepare, his movements economical and precise. He packed dried venison and a bedroll, checked the shoes on his sturdiest horse, and cleaned his rifle until the barrel gleamed. He said little, but a new tension had settled between them since the night she had woken to find him watching her. An awareness, sharp and unsettling, hummed in the air whenever they were close. He was even more careful to avoid her eyes, to keep a physical distance between them, as if he feared a spark might leap across the gap. When he was ready to leave, he stood by the door for a moment, his broad shoulders filling the frame. "Keep the door barred at night," he said, his gaze fixed on a point just over her head. "And keep the rifle loaded." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He gave a curt nod in return and was gone. She stood in the doorway and watched him ride away, a solitary, powerful figure growing smaller and smaller against the immense backdrop of the mountains, until he was swallowed by the pines. The silence he left behind was a different kind of quiet. It was not the companionable silence of shared work, but the hollow, ringing emptiness of true solitude. The first day passed in a flurry of nervous activity. Clara weeded the garden with a vengeance, scrubbed the cabin floor, and mended a tear in her dress. She kept busy to keep the fear at bay, but as dusk began to bleed across the sky, the loneliness returned, more potent than ever. She barred the door as he had instructed and sat with the heavy rifle across her lap, its cold weight a poor substitute for his presence. That night, the old nightmares returned. She was back in Ohio, her stepfather's greedy eyes watching her, his voice a smooth poison as he sold her future away. She woke with a gasp, the cabin dark and silent around her, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fear was a living thing, a shadow lurking in the corners of the room. She had grown so accustomed to the sound of his breathing in the dark, the quiet presence of his body across the room, that his absence felt like a missing limb, a raw and vulnerable emptiness. The next day was worse. The sky grew dark and bruised in the afternoon, and a summer storm rolled in from the peaks. It was not a blizzard of snow, but a violent tantrum of thunder and rain. Lightning split the sky, followed by crashes of thunder that echoed through the valleys like cannon fire. Rain fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the clearing into a sea of mud. Clara huddled by the fire, trying to read one of the few books Elias owned, but the words blurred before her eyes. Every clap of thunder made her jump. It was during one of these earth-shaking booms that she heard another sound, a weak, desperate pounding on the cabin door. Her blood ran cold. It could not be Elias. He was not due back for at least 2 more days. A wolf? A bear? No, it was the sound of a human fist. She crept to the door, her heart in her throat, the rifle clutched in her trembling hands. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice thin against the roar of the storm. A man's voice, weak and strained, answered, "Please, shelter, I'm hurt." She hesitated, Elias's warning echoing in her mind, but the voice sounded less like a threat and more like a plea. Through a small crack in the shutter, she could see a figure slumped against the door, a man soaked to the bone, his face pale and drawn with pain. Taking a deep breath, she unbarred the door and opened it. The man who stumbled inside was a prospector. Judging by his worn clothes and the muddy pack on his back, he was older, perhaps 50, with a weathered face and kind, tired eyes. A nasty gash on his lower leg was bleeding sluggishly, staining his canvas trousers a dark, rusty brown. "Thank you, ma'am," he rasped, leaning heavily against the doorframe. "Got caught in the storm. Slipped on the rocks. Name's Silas. I won't be no trouble. Just need a place to wait out the rain." Clara's fear warred with her compassion. He looked wretched and genuinely hurt. Leaving him outside in this storm was a death sentence. Her mother's voice, a distant echo from a gentler life, whispered in her ear, "You do not turn away someone in need." "Come in," she said, her voice firmer now. "Sit by the fire." She helped the man to one of the chairs, her nose wrinkling at the scent of damp wool and unwashed man. She fetched the water bucket and clean rags, the same ones she had used on Elias's hand. Her own hands were steady as she knelt and carefully cleaned the man's wound. It was deep, but the bleeding was slowing. She bound it tightly with a strip of clean linen. Silas watched her with grateful eyes. "You've a gentle hand. Ma'am, your husband is a lucky man." He drank the water she offered him greedily. "Is he around?" "He is away," Clara said, busying herself by hanging the man's wet coat near the fire. "He is due back in a few days." The storm raged for the rest of the day. Silas, exhausted and weak, mostly dozed in the chair. He was a simple man who spoke of gold claims and bad luck, and his presence, once she grew accustomed to it, was oddly comforting. It was another human voice, another soul to share the oppressive silence. When evening fell, she made a thin stew and they ate together. She gave him a blanket and he made a bed for himself on the floor by the hearth, insisting he would not trouble her further. The arrangement felt proper, an act of Christian charity. The fear had receded, replaced by a quiet sense of competence. She had faced a crisis on her own and handled it. The storm broke sometime before dawn. Clara woke to the sound of dripping water and the first tentative chirps of birds. Silas was still asleep by the fire. She felt a small swell of pride. She had been strong. She had been capable. She was so lost in this feeling that she did not hear the hoofbeats until they were right outside. The door swung open, and Elias was there. He stood on the threshold, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion from riding through the night. His eyes, sunken and tired, took in the scene before him, the strange man asleep on his floor, the unfamiliar coat drying by his fire, his wife standing there in her nightgown. And his face changed. The weariness was consumed by a flash of something dark and violent. A terrible, blazing rage lit his eyes from within. It was not the controlled fury he had unleashed on the men in the clearing. This was different. It was raw, jagged, and deeply personal. It was the rage of a man who believed he had been betrayed. Silas, woken by the sudden cold draft, sat up with a groan. He saw Elias standing there, a figure of terrifying menace, and his face went pale with fear. "Now, hold on," Silas began, scrambling to his feet. "It ain't what you think." Elias did not speak. He took one step into the room, and the force of his presence was like a physical blow. The air crackled with it. Silas, a man accustomed to the dangers of the wild, recognized a threat greater than any bear. He grabbed his still damp coat and his pack and fled, stumbling out of the cabin and disappearing into the wet, gray morning without a backward glance. The silence he left behind was thick and suffocating. Elias slowly closed the door, his eyes never leaving Clara. The rage was still there, but it was now banked, a bed of hot coals beneath a thin layer of ice. "What was he doing in my home?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Clara's brief moment of pride had curdled into a cold knot of dread, but a spark of indignation ignited within her. She lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed. "He was hurt. The storm." "I told you to keep the door barred." "He would have died out there," she retorted, her voice rising. "Was I supposed to just leave him?" You were supposed to be safe, he bit out, his fists clenching at his sides. You were supposed to listen. I listened to my conscience, she cried, taking a step toward him. Something you know nothing about. You see a stranger in need, and all you can see is a threat. You trust no one and nothing. Elias, not even me. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. The anger in his eyes faltered, replaced by a deep, wounded pain. Trust? He scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. You talk of trust? All I see is your pity. You look at me and you see a broken thing, a scarred brute to be pitied and managed. You felt sorry for that man, just like you feel sorry for me. That is not true. Is it not? Every gentle word, every careful gesture from you is an act of charity. The poor, lonely mountain man, the poor, wounded prospector. It is all the same to you. You give your kindness away like alms for the poor because it makes you feel righteous. The injustice of his words was a slap in the face. All the fear, all the loneliness, all the desperate effort she had put into building a life here. All of it boiled over. And what would you have me do? She screamed, tears of frustration streaming down her face. You will not touch me. You will not speak to me. You barely even look at me. I am a ghost in this house. Elias, a ghost in my own life. I do everything I can to make a home for us. And you see nothing. You feel nothing. All you have is your pride and your mistrust. The emotional dam between them finally broke, releasing a torrent of pain and resentment. His face crumpled. The anger and pride stripped away, leaving only a raw, desperate vulnerability. You think I don't feel anything? He choked out, his voice thick with an agony that stunned her into silence. I have fought myself every single day since you arrived. Every time you walk past me, every time I hear you breathe in the night, I have to fight it. The guilt, the desire. He took a ragged breath, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I cannot take you. Clara, I cannot claim you like a husband would claim a wife. Not when you were sold to me. Not when you never chose me. It would make me no better than your stepfather. It would make me a monster. The confession, torn from the deepest part of him, hung in the air, devastating and absolute. It was not rejection that had kept him from her bed. It was a fierce, protective, and utterly misguided sense of honor. Clara stared at him, her own anger dissolving into a wave of aching sorrow. Her body began to tremble, and a sob tore itself from her chest. I do not know what I want anymore, she wept, her words barely audible. I just want to stop feeling so invisible. She sank onto a chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with a grief too deep for words. He stood in the middle of the room, a man shipwrecked by his own convictions, unable to move, unable to offer the comfort they both so desperately needed. The silence that fell between them in the following days was a cold, dead thing. It was heavier and more profound than any silence they had known before. They moved around each other like ghosts, the raw wounds of their argument left open and bleeding. They avoided each other's eyes. They ate their meals in shifts. They slept in a silence so complete it felt like a tomb. The cabin, once a fragile sanctuary, was now a prison for two. Then, on the third night of this Cold War, the mountain screamed. It began with a flash of light so brilliant it lit the entire valley, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so violent the cabin itself seemed to jump from its foundation. A dry lightning strike. Clara sat bolt upright in bed. Through the window, she saw a horrifying orange glow on the ridge behind the cabin. The door burst open. Fire, Elias said, his voice stripped of all emotion except a terrible urgency. The whole ridge is going up. We have to move, now. The argument, the silence, their personal anguish, it all vanished, burned away by a primal, immediate fear. Adrenaline surged through Clara's veins. Elias was already in motion, his actions swift and instinctual. He ran to the lean-to, cutting the horses free and slapping their rumps, sending them galloping in a panic down the mountain pass, away from the flames. The fire was moving impossibly fast. a roaring, monstrous beast of orange and red, consuming the dry pines with a deafening hunger. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to pour down into the clearing. Elias rushed back to the cabin. "Get to the creek!" he yelled over the roar. He grabbed 2 heavy woolen blankets, soaked them in the water bucket, and threw one over her head, pulling it down around her shoulders. "Keep your head down. Breathe through the cloth." He wrapped the other one around himself and grabbed her arm, pulling her out into the nightmare. The heat was a physical blow, a furnace blast that stole the air from her lungs. Embers rained down around them like fiery snow. The world was smoke and chaos and the terrifying roar of the inferno. They ran, stumbling through the smoke-filled clearing, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming. They half fell, half slid down the steep bank to the creek, collapsing at the water's edge as the fire swept over the ridge above them, consuming the trees that had been their shelter. The cabin, their home, was silhouetted for a moment against the wall of flame, and then it, too, was gone. They lay there on the damp earth, gasping for air, the roar of the fire in their ears, the heat scorching their faces even from a distance. Everything was gone. The garden, the coop, the cabin, everything they had built together. All of it turned to ash. In the terrible, flickering light of their burning world, Elias rolled over and looked at her. His face was black with soot, his eyes wide with a wild, raw emotion she had never seen before. The barriers were gone, the pride, the guilt, the silence. All of it had been burned away in the inferno. All that was left was the truth. He reached out, his hand trembling, and for the first time, he touched her face. His calloused, soot-stained thumb gently stroked her cheek, a touch as tender and reverent as a prayer. He looked into her eyes, and she saw his own past and their shared, terrifying present reflected there. "I won't let this world take you, too," he whispered, his voice a broken, ragged promise against the roar of the flames. The dawn that followed the fire was gray and silent, the world hushed in a shroud of smoke and shock. The rising sun was a pale, sickly disk behind the haze, casting a weak orange light on a landscape of devastation. Where their meadow had been, there was now a blackened, smoking plain. The forest on the ridge was a graveyard of skeletal, charred trees. The cabin, their home, was a pile of smoldering timbers and a defiant, solitary stone chimney pointing a finger at the sky. Everything was gone. They stood by the creek, 2 small, soot-stained figures in a ruined world. The memory of the night, the roar, the heat, the terror, was a nightmare that clung to them in the daylight. But Elias's words, his ragged promise whispered in the firelight, were just as real. "I won't let this world take you, too." The words echoed in the silence, a foundation stone laid in the ashes. Survival was a stark, immediate need. They were alive, but they had nothing. Elias's eyes, grim and determined, scanned the ravaged landscape. "There's an old miner's shack," he said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "A mile up the valley. It won't be much, but it's shelter." The shack was a derelict thing, leaning against the hillside as if exhausted. Its roof sagged, and the single room was small and damp, smelling of earth and rot and the ghosts of forgotten prospectors. But it had 4 walls and a mostly intact roof. It was a refuge from the elements, a place to begin again. For the first few days, they moved in a daze, their actions driven by pure instinct. Elias managed to salvage a few cast-iron pots from the ruins, blackened but usable. He hunted with a grim efficiency, providing them with meat. Clara foraged for late-season berries and edible roots, her hands and dress stained with dirt and juice. Then the work of rebuilding began. Elias was a man possessed. He refused to be beaten by the mountain or the fire. From dawn until dusk, he worked, his axe ringing out in the quiet valley, a sound of stubborn defiance. He felled fire-damaged but still sound trees from the edge of the burn, his muscles straining as he squared them into logs for a new cabin. The work was punishing, relentless. But he seemed to thrive on it. He was not just building a home. He was fighting back against the fate that had tried to claim them. While he built, Clara found her own way to rebuild. She had salvaged a single, half-burned book from the ashes. The pages were brittle and stained, but inside, tucked between them, were a few sheets of miraculously untouched paper and a nub of a pencil. In the quiet hours, while Elias was in the forest, she began to write. She wrote letters she knew she could never send, letters that were her only outlet for the storm of feelings inside her. She wrote to her mother, pouring out the story of her journey, her fear, and the strange, unexpected turns her life had taken. "He is not a monster. Mama," she wrote, the pencil scratching softly. "He is just a man who has lost too much. I see the kindness in him, even when he tries to hide it. I think I am not as afraid as I once was." She wrote to the preacher in Big Elk, a letter full of unspoken questions about faith and duty, and the nature of a marriage that had been a transaction but was slowly, painfully, becoming something more. And, most often, she wrote to Elias. These were the letters she kept hidden deepest, the words she could not yet bring herself to speak aloud. The fire took everything. One letter read, "But it did not take us. When you touched my face that night, it was the first time I felt real. Not like property, not like a burden, but like a person. Like Clary, I am so tired of being afraid. Elias, I want to know what lies on the other side of it." Their life in the tiny shack forced a new kind of intimacy upon them. The small space was filled with the sounds of their existence, the soft scratch of her pencil, the steady rhythm of his breathing as he slept, exhausted on the floor, the quiet scrape of a spoon against a bowl. They worked together, their movements falling into an easy, unspoken rhythm. She would bring him water in the forest, and he would watch her approach with an unguarded look in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. She patched the tears in his worn shirts, her fingers tracing the strong seams, and he would sit and watch her, his usual stillness now feeling less like distance and more like a quiet appreciation. One evening, he sat by the fire, whittling at a piece of pale, smooth birch wood. He worked for hours, the knife moving with a surprising delicacy in his large, calloused hands. When he was finished, he held it out to her. It was a comb, its teeth perfectly carved, the handle shaped into the form of a lily. It was simple, beautiful, and made for her. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and the warmth of the contact lingered long after he pulled away. She had nothing to give him in return but a small, tremulous smile. But it seemed to be enough. As autumn began to lay its cold hand on the valley, a traveling doctor made his way through the mountains, a rare visitor on his way to a remote mining camp. Doctor Finch was a kind, elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose and a gentle, probing manner. Elias had flagged him down, concerned about a cough that had settled in Clara's chest. The doctor examined her thoroughly, his expression growing more concerned. "You are exhausted, young lady," he said, his voice grave. "And you are far too thin. Your body has no reserves. If you were to fall ill, truly ill, you would have a difficult time fighting it. You must rest, and you must eat more." The warning hung in the air after he left. Elias's face was a grim, worried mask. He looked at Clara, at the pale thinness of her face and the dark circles under her eyes, and a familiar, terrible fear settled in his gaze. He had seen this before. He knew how quickly a life could be extinguished in this harsh country. From that day on, he began to make a secret sacrifice. At their meals, he would claim he was not hungry, that he had eaten while he was out. He would insist she take the larger portion of the meat, pushing the best pieces onto her plate. She argued at first, but he was stubborn, and she was too tired to fight him. She did not realize, not until much later, that he was slowly, quietly, starving himself to keep her strong. He was giving her his own life force, one meal at a time. But the doctor's warning proved prophetic. A harsh, unnatural frost fell early, killing the last of the plants and freezing the ground solid. A week later, the first snow began to fall, not the gentle flakes of a coming winter, but a wet, heavy snow that promised a long and bitter season. The cold seeped into the poorly chinked walls of the miner's shack, and the dampness was inescapable. Clara's cough worsened. A fever took hold, leaving her weak and shivering one moment, burning the next. Soon, she could barely lift her head. The pneumonia that doctor Finch had feared had come for her. Elias's quiet fear erupted into a desperate, frantic battle. He did not sleep. For days and nights, he was a constant, vigilant presence at her side. He kept the fire roaring, using up their precious wood supply. He brewed foul-tasting teas from willow bark and herbs, forcing the bitter liquid between her lips. He bathed her feverish skin with snowmelt, his touch surprisingly gentle. He held her when the shivers racked her frail body, wrapping her in his own blankets, trying to warm her with his own heat. He was a man fighting a war against a ghost, a sickness he could not see or punch or drive away, and he was terrified he was losing. On the third night, when her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper, he fell to his knees beside her makeshift bed. He, who had turned his back on God after the landslide had stolen his family, who claimed not to believe in anything but the hard reality of stone and timber, began to pray. His voice was a raw, broken whisper in the dark, a desperate, bargaining plea. "Don't take her," he begged, his head bowed, his massive shoulders shaking. "Please, not her. You can have anything else. You can have me. Just let her live. Don't let this world take her, too." Clara was lost in the fog of the fever, drifting in and out of a world of confused dreams and fleeting reality. She was vaguely aware of his presence, a warm, solid anchor in the storm of her illness. She heard his voice, a low rumble that soothed the sharp edges of her pain. In a moment of fleeting, feverish clarity, she opened her eyes and saw his face hovering above hers, his features etched with an anguish so profound it pierced through her delirium. A single, overwhelming feeling rose up through the fog. Love. It was a pure, simple, and undeniable truth. Her lips parted, and she breathed a single, faint sentence into the quiet room. "I love you, Elias." He froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He stared down at her, his face a mask of shock, his eyes wide with a wild, terrified hope. He had prayed for her life, but he had never dared to pray for this. The words he had longed to hear, the words he believed he would never deserve, were a gift he was too afraid to accept. He did not answer. He could not. He simply stared. A man seeing a ghost, or perhaps a miracle, and unable to tell the difference. When the fever finally broke, it was like waking from a long and terrible dream. Clara felt weak, washed out, but her mind was clear for the first time in days. She found Elias asleep in a chair by her bed, his head slumped on his chest, a look of utter exhaustion on his face. He had saved her life. But as she regained her strength over the following days, a new distance grew between them. The desperate intimacy of her illness was gone, replaced by a careful, guarded quiet. He treated her with a gentle, almost clinical care, but he would not meet her eyes. He retreated back behind his wall of silence. She remembered murmuring something in her fever, but the memory was hazy, indistinct. She did not know that her delirious confession had terrified him. He was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that what he had heard was real. He had been given a glimpse of a future he desperately wanted, and the fear of it being a fever dream, the fear of losing it, was too much to bear. So he pulled away, protecting his own scarred heart. A month later, when Clara was strong enough to walk the clearing and the new cabin's walls stood shoulder high, a trapper passing through brought news from Big Elk. The news was for her. Her stepfather, Franklin, had been found, He had made it as far as a mining town in the Dakota Territory. He had been shot and killed during a card game that had turned ugly. The $500 Elias had paid for her was long gone, spent on whiskey and gambling, but his death cleared his debts. The last tie to her old life had been violently, definitively severed. The news spread, as news always did. The next time the trapper came by, he brought the town's gossip with him. Some folks, mostly the women, felt pity for the poor, orphaned girl, finally free of the man who had sold her. They whispered that Elias Boone should do the decent thing and seek an annulment. Let her go back east and find a proper life. She was free now, they said. She did not have to stay with the mountain man. The words circled in Clara's mind. She was free, legally, financially, emotionally free. She could leave. The choice, for the first time, was entirely her own. That evening, she found Elias by the half-finished wall of their new home, his hands resting on the sturdy, interlocking logs. He was staring out at the sunset, his profile etched against the fading light. She walked up to him, her heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. The time for unspoken feelings and fearful silence was over. He did not turn as she approached. "You heard the news," he said. It was not a question. "You are free to go. Clary, I will not stop you. I can give you the money for the stagecoach." She stood beside him, looking not at the sunset, but at his face. She saw the pain in the tight set of his jaw, the resignation in his eyes. He was offering her an escape, convinced it was what she must want, what she deserved. "Do you still think I was forced to be your wife?" she asked, her voice quiet but strong, carrying clearly in the crisp evening air. He finally turned to look at her, his stormy gray eyes searching hers, seeing the strength, the resolve, the unwavering certainty that he had never allowed himself to see before. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips, the last of his fear, the last of his doubt. "Not anymore," he answered, his voice thick with a decade of grief and a lifetime of hope. Winter returned to the mountain not as an enemy, but as an old acquaintance. It settled in gently, draping the peaks in a fresh, immaculate white and silencing the world under a soft blanket of snow. This time, there was a fortress to stand against it. The new cabin was a monument to their shared will, built on a foundation of solid rock and sealed with a resilience born of fire and flood. It was larger than the first, with a window that faced the sunrise and a hearth of smooth river stones that drew the smoke cleanly up the chimney. The smoke that rose from that chimney now was not a lonely signal of survival, but a steady, hopeful promise of home. The cold, dead silence that had once haunted their lives was gone, replaced by a new kind of quiet. It was a comfortable, living silence, filled with the easy rhythm of two people who had learned to read each other's thoughts in the space between words. It was in the way Elias would look up from his work when she entered the room, a warmth in his eyes that he no longer tried to hide. It was in the way she would place a cup of hot coffee by his hand in the morning without being asked. They were small, simple gestures, but they were the language of their new life, a language of trust and quiet affection. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Elias looked up from the harness he was mending and spoke into the comfortable quiet. "I am riding down to Big Elk tomorrow," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I'm going to ask Reverend Michael to come back up the mountain." Clara looked at him, her mending forgotten in her lap. "What for, Elias?" His stormy eyes met hers, and there was no trace of the old fear or doubt in them, only a calm, unwavering certainty. "To do it right this time," he said, "to renew our vows, not as a transaction or a duty to the town, but as a choice, our choice." The preacher arrived a week later, his horse picking its way carefully through the snow. Reverend Michael looked older and more tired than Clara remembered, but as he dismounted, his eyes widened in surprise. He saw the new, strong cabin. He saw the wisp of smoke, and he saw the man and woman who stood waiting for him. Elias was no longer the haunted, wild recluse. and Clara was no longer the pale, terrified girl. They stood together, a quiet strength flowing between them, a unit forged in the heart of the wilderness. Word of the preacher's journey spread through the town with the speed of a winter wind. A second wedding for the Boones? The gossips were alight with speculation. What could it mean? Was he finally claiming her properly? Was she being forced into it again? Curiosity, that powerful and relentless force in a small town, was piqued. On the day of the ceremony, a small, bundled-up procession of townsfolk made their way up the mountain trail. Mr. Abernathy, the postmaster, came, his face a mixture of nervousness and genuine curiosity. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Gable, whose whispers had once been so sharp, arrived with a basket containing a freshly baked apple pie, a peace offering. A few other silent, watchful faces from the town dotted the clearing, their expressions guarded, expecting another cold, awkward ceremony like the first one. They gathered before the new cabin, their boots crunching on the pristine snow. The air was sharp and cold, but the sun was brilliant in a vast blue sky, and the light reflecting off the snow was dazzling. Clara stood beside Elias, not in a fine Eastern dress, but in a simple gown of blue wool she had painstakingly sewn herself. It was the dress of a mountain woman, strong and practical and beautiful in its simplicity. She did not feel the cold. A warmth bloomed in her chest, a quiet, radiant joy that pushed back the winter chill. Reverend Michael opened his Bible, his voice less shaky this time, steadied by the palpable change in the couple before him. He spoke the familiar, solemn words about love and commitment, but this time, the words did not feel hollow. They felt true, earned through hardship and sacrifice. When it was Elias's turn to speak his vows, his voice did not falter. It was a deep, resonant rumble, a promise made not just to her or to God, but to the mountain itself, the witness to their entire journey. Clara's own voice was a soft, clear echo of his, a promise freely, joyfully given. As the preacher finished the final blessing, a hush fell over the small crowd. They waited, expecting a curt nod, a swift end to the proceedings just like before. But Elias did something no one, least of all Clara, could have ever predicted. He turned to her, his expression full of a love so profound it made her breath catch in her throat. And then, the massive, scarred mountain man, the fearsome Elias Boone, slowly knelt down in the snow before her. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. He ignored them. His eyes were only for her. From the pocket of his coat, he pulled a small, familiar object. It was her mother's silver locket. She had taken it off during the worst of her fever, and he had kept it safe all this time, a secret treasure. With a reverence that made her heart ache, he reached up and fastened the delicate chain around her neck. The cool metal felt like a benediction against her skin. He remained there on one knee, looking up at her. His wife. "You were never mine to take, Clary," he said, his voice thick with emotion but clear enough for all to hear. "You were sold, and you were sent, but you were never mine. Not until you chose to be." He gently touched the locket that now rested against her chest. "You chose to stay. You chose to rebuild. You chose me. That's what makes you my wife." A profound silence descended upon the clearing, a silence so complete she could hear the beat of her own heart. It was a silence of awe, of understanding. Then, a single person began to clap. It was Mrs. Gable, her gloved hands coming together slowly, deliberately. Then Mr. Abernathy joined in, and soon, a warm, genuine wave of applause rippled through the small crowd. Clara looked out at the faces of the townsfolk, and for the first time, she did not see pity in their eyes. She did not see suspicion or fear. She saw respect. She saw admiration. She saw, in the tearful smile of Mrs. Gable, a welcome. She had not married the town's monster. She had revealed the man. She reached down and placed her hand on Elias's shoulder. Her touch telling him to rise, he stood, and for the first time, in front of the world, he drew her into his arms. That night, the cabin was a sanctuary of warmth and light against the vast, dark wilderness. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft, golden glow on the new log walls. Outside, the snow fell in a silent, steady curtain, sealing them in their own private world. The apple pie from Mrs. Gable sat on the table, a sweet promise of a new beginning. All the barriers that had stood between them for so long, fear, guilt, grief, and pride, had been burned away, washed away, or simply surrendered. There was nothing left to hide behind. Elias came to her as she stood by the fire, his movements no longer hesitant or restrained. He gently took her hands in his large, calloused palms enveloping her smaller ones. "Clary," he whispered, his voice full of a wonder he could no longer contain. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate relief like the one in the fire, but a slow, tender exploration, a question and an answer all at once. It was a kiss that spoke of patience, of reverence, of a love that had taken root in the hardest of soils and had, against all odds, bloomed. In the soft, flickering light of the fire, they finally shared what had long been denied them. It was not the clumsy, fearful encounter she had once dreaded, but a slow, sacred discovery of each other. Every touch was an apology for past hurts, every whisper a promise for the future. It was a joining not just of bodies, but of souls, a quiet, perfect union of two people who had been broken apart by the world and had found a way to make each other whole again. There, in the heart of the great, silent mountain, they found a tenderness that healed, a passion that redeemed, and a peace that felt as deep and as eternal as the stars shining in the cold winter sky above. Clara woke the next morning to a world of profound quiet. She was wrapped in Elias's arms, her head resting on his chest, the slow, steady beat of his heart, a comforting rhythm beneath her ear. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, but the cabin was filled with a soft, diffused light. She slipped from the bed, pulling on one of his warm woolen shirts, and padded to the window. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, a thick, perfect layer that covered the entire world in white. The sun was just beginning to rise, and through a break in the clouds, a brilliant shaft of golden light broke through, setting the snow-covered peaks ablaze. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She thought of the terrified girl who had arrived on a rattling stagecoach, a piece of property sold to a fearsome stranger. She thought of the hunger, the cold, the fire, the flood, the sickness. The mountain had taken so much. It had taken her old life, her fears, her illusions. But it had also given her everything that truly mattered. It had given her a strength she never knew she possessed. It had given her a home, built with her own two hands. And it had given her this man, her husband, and a love that was not a transaction or a duty, but a thing freely chosen, unbroken by fear or shame. She felt his presence behind her, felt the warmth of his body before his arms circled her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking out at the magnificent vista with her. "You're home now, Clary," he whispered, his voice a soft rumble against her ear. She smiled, a deep, contented smile that came from the very core of her being. She reached up and placed her hand over his, which rested on her heart. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, a steady, peaceful sound in the quiet wilderness. She was home. Thank you for listening to our story at the Wild West Campfire channel. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments so we can all connect, and please subscribe and share your thoughts in English.